The wind at 14,000 feet does not just freeze the skin, it silences the soul. It was June 1947. Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans stood at the edge of the world in the forbidden Bayan-Har mountains of Tibet. Before him lay a grave that science said should not exist. The row of small mounds stretched into the mist, each one hiding a secret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knelt in the snow, his breath forming ghosts in the thin air, and brushed away the dirt. The skeleton inside was fragile, only 4 feet tall. The skull was disproportionately large, bulbous, unlike any human ethnicity known to man or history. But the terror did not come from the bones. It came from the object clutched against the rib cage, a granite disc, a perfect circle with a double spiral groove, humming, faintly, with a frequency recorded 12,000 years ago. This was not a tomb for a man. It was a waiting room for a traveler who never made it home. When Dr. Evans died in 1974, his family expected to find a will. Instead, they found a manuscript known as the Lolladoff Report. For 27 years, this distinguished Oxford professor had kept his silence. He chose to die with his reputation intact rather than speak the impossible truth. That in 1947, he lived among a tribe that did not belong to this earth, the Dropa. The diary pages you are about to hear describe a crash landing from the distant stars, a 12,000-year exile, and a technology that we are still trying to understand today. But before we open the forbidden file, I have a question for you. If we found absolute proof today that intelligent beings have been stranded on Earth for thousands of years, just waiting for help, should we help them leave, or should we keep them here to study their technology? Answer help, or keep in the comments below. I am curious to see where your morality lies. Subscribe to the channel now and prepare yourself. We are going back to 1947. The diary entry is dated June 5th, 1947. It begins not with a declaration of discovery, but with a confession of fear. Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans sat in a small tea house in Lhasa, watching the steam rise from a cup of yak butter tea. Outside, the prayer flags whipped violently in the wind, snapping like whips. He wrote that he felt like a man standing on a plank, blindfolded, waiting to step off into a void. He was thousands of miles from the mahogany desks of Oxford. He was thousands of miles from sanity. He had come to Tibet chasing a ghost story, a rumor whispered by a Polish explorer years prior, a story of a mountain range where the birds refused to fly, the Bayan-Har Ula. Even the name sounded harsh, like gravel grinding against bone. The local monks did not like to speak of it. When Evans asked for a map, they looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion. They told him that the Bayan-Har was not a place for men. They said it was the home of the Dropa. In the local dialect, the word didn't mean demon or god. It meant something far more unsettling. It translated roughly to the broken ones, or those who cannot stand. The expedition left Lhasa on June 10th. It was a modest caravan, Dr. Evans, 3 Sherpa guides, and 4 yaks heavily laden with supplies. For the first week, the journey was brutal but standard. They navigated narrow passes where the path was no wider than a man's shoulders, with a drop of 3,000 feet on one side. They slept in tents that froze stiff by midnight. But as they pushed north, leaving the familiar trade routes behind, the mood shifted. By the second week, the landscape began to change. The lush green valleys of lower Tibet vanished. The sky turned a darker, more violent shade of blue. The air grew so thin that every step required a conscious decision to breathe. Evans noted in his journal that his dreams were becoming vivid, terrifyingly clear. He dreamed of fire falling from the sky. He dreamed of a loud, mechanical screaming sound that shattered the mountains. He attributed this to the altitude, to the lack of oxygen starving his brain. But looking back now, we have to wonder, was it hypoxia? Or was he getting closer to the source of a 12,000-year-old trauma that still stained the land? On June 23rd, they reached the threshold. They were at 12,000 feet. Ahead of them lay a jagged wall of black rock covered in perpetual mist. The Bayan-Har. The head Sherpa, a man named Tenzing, who had climbed Everest's lower slopes without fear, stopped his yak. He refused to take another step. He didn't speak. He simply pointed at the mountains and shook his head. Evans offered him more money. He offered him double the rate. Tenzing looked at the coins in Evans's hand and spat on the ground. He spoke a sentence that Evans transcribed phonetically in his diary. "The sky demons eat the soul, not the flesh." The guides turned back. They left the supplies on the rocks, took their animals, and descended as fast as they could, as if a fire were chasing them. They didn't even look back to wave goodbye. For the first time in his life, Dr. Evans was truly alone. The silence of the high Himalayas is not peaceful. It is oppressive. It is a heavy, crushing weight. There is no rustle of leaves, for there are no trees. There is no sound of insects. There is only the sound of your own blood pumping in your ears, louder than a drum. Evans loaded his pack. It was too heavy. He had to leave behind his extra clothes, his extra fuel. He took only the essentials: food, his journal, his camera, and his revolver. He climbed. June 25, 1947. The diary entries become erratic here. The handwriting is shaky. The cold was seeping into his joints, making every movement agony. He describes the terrain as alien. The rocks were not the usual sedimentary layers. They were twisted, melted, fused together as if subjected to immense, sudden heat thousands of years ago. He found craters that looked like geysers, but they were dry. The geology made no sense. It was as if a war had been fought here. A war with weapons that melted stone, and then nature had spent 10 millennia trying to cover up the scars. He walked for 3 days into the heart of the Forbidden Zone. He began to feel watched. It wasn't the feeling of a predator stalking prey. It was different. He felt analyzed. He would stop, scan the gray ridges with his binoculars, and see nothing but shifting shadows. But the sensation persisted, a prickling on the back of his neck. The feeling of eyes, many eyes, tracking his progress through the snow. On the 4th day of his solo trek, the weather turned. A blizzard swept down from the peaks with zero warning. The whiteout was instant. Evans lost all sense of direction. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at his coat, freezing his eyelashes together. He stumbled blindly, his hands numb, his mind drifting into the warm, dangerous lethargy of hypothermia. He knew he was going to die. He sat down in the lee of a large boulder, unable to go further. He took out his diary to write a final entry, a goodbye to his wife in England. The ink in his pen was frozen. He couldn't write. He closed his eyes and waited for the end. The cold was no longer painful. It was a warm blanket wrapping around him. And then he felt the touch. It was not the wind. It was a hand, a small, warm hand gripping his shoulder. Evans snapped his eyes open. Through the swirling snow, he saw a silhouette. It was small, like a child. He tried to speak, but his jaw was frozen shut. The figure did not speak. It leaned in closer. Evans saw a face wrapped in rough furs. He saw a skin that was yellow, not from jaundice, but from a pigment he had never seen. And he saw the eyes, large, deep, sorrowful blue eyes that seemed to hold the light of a different sun. The figure gestured for him to stand. Evans couldn't. His legs were dead weight. The small being, barely 4 feet tall, signaled into the storm. 2 more figures appeared from the white void. Despite their frail appearance, they moved with an efficiency that defied the storm. They didn't lift him. They guided him. They supported his weight, dragging the Oxford professor through the snow. They led him toward a fissure in the rock face, a narrow crack that emitted a faint, warm vapor. As they crossed the threshold, the wind died instantly. The roar of the blizzard was replaced by a heavy, damp silence. Evans blinked. his vision blurring. He was inside a cave system, but the walls were not natural. They were smooth, glazed. He looked at his rescuers. In the dim light, they looked like ghosts or goblins from a fairy tale. But as he looked closer, he saw the truth. Their clothes were rags made of woven beast hair, but around the neck of the leader, hanging on a piece of twisted gut, was a pendant. It wasn't a bone, it wasn't a stone. It was a perfect disc of silver metal, uncorroded, shining with a geometric precision that no primitive hand could have crafted. Dr. Evans realized, as he drifted into unconsciousness, that he had not found a lost tribe of humans. He had found something else. The map had ended, but the journey had just begun. The Sherpas were right to be afraid. But they were wrong about the demons. These were not demons. They were survivors, and they had been waiting for him. Dr. Evans woke to the smell of burning fat and the sound of silence. It was a silence deeper than the mountains, a silence that felt heavy, as if the very air in the cave was pressurized. He lay on a bed of matted furs, his body aching from the thaw. For a long time, he kept his eyes closed, listening. He expected the rough voices of bandits or the guttural language of the local tribes. Instead, he heard a sound that chilled him, a high-pitched, melodic chattering. It sounded like birds, or perhaps the vocalizations of dolphins, echoing softly off the stone walls. He opened his eyes. The cave was illuminated by a single fire in the center of the floor. The smoke drifted up toward a fissure in the ceiling, disappearing into the dark rock. And there, sitting in a circle around the flames, were the Dropa. In the flickering light, they looked like children wearing the skins of old men. There were perhaps 20 of them in this chamber. They were incredibly slight, their limbs thin and fragile, as if a strong gust of wind could shatter them. But it was their heads that commanded attention. They were bulbous, oversized craniums balancing precariously on spindly necks. Their hair was sparse, wispy black strands clinging to yellow-tinged skin. Dr. Evans sat up. The chattering stopped instantly. 20 pairs of eyes turned to him. They were iris-dominant, wide, and a piercing, impossible blue. In 1947, the world knew of many races, but this phenotype existed on no chart in Oxford. Fear is a biological response to the unknown. But as Evans looked at them, his fear vanished. It was replaced by an overwhelming sense of pity. These were not the monsters of the Sherpa legends. These were the wretched of the earth. There was no aggression in their posture, only a terrified curiosity. They looked at him not as a predator looks at prey, but as a starving man looks at a loaf of bread, with a mixture of hope and disbelief. For the next 3 months, Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans ceased to be a professor. He became a student. He lived in the hives of the Bayan-Har. He ate the tasteless tubers they dug from the frozen earth. He drank the melted snow, and he watched them. He noticed immediately that they were physically unsuited for this environment. They moved slowly with great effort. It was as if gravity itself was their enemy. Every step they took seemed to require a negotiation with the earth. They suffered from joint pain. He could see it in the way the elders rubbed their knees and elbows. They were a lowland species, or perhaps a low-gravity species, forced to live on the roof of the world. Communication was a slow, painful process. It began with pointing: rock, fire, sky, hand. The leader of the group was a being Evans came to know as Lue Pa. Lue Pa was old, his skin wrinkled like parchment paper. He was the keeper of the history. He spent hours with Evans, sitting by the fire, teaching him the sounds of their language. It was a tonal language, complex and musical, utterly unrelated to Chinese or Tibetan. But they didn't just speak, they drew. Lue Pa would smooth out a patch of dirt and draw circles. Solar systems. He would point to the third circle, Earth, and then point to the ground. Then he would point to a star system Evans did not recognize, far off in the chart, and press his hand to his chest. Home. The gesture was universal. It broke the barrier of species. Evans realized he was sitting next to a being who was homesick on a planetary scale. The revelation came in August. The summer storms had abated, and the air was clear. Lupa woke Evans in the middle of the night cycle and beckoned him deeper into the cave system. They walked past the sleeping families, huddled together for warmth, and entered a tunnel that Evans had never seen before. The walls here were different. They were smooth, glazed with a substance that looked like glass but felt warm to the touch. They entered a circular chamber, a perfect dome carved into the mountain's heart. In the center, resting on a pedestal of natural rock, was the treasure of the Dropa. It was not gold. It was not jewels. It was a library. Hundreds of stone discs were stacked in rows. These were the Lolladoff plates. Evans approached them with trembling hands. Each disc was about a foot in diameter, with a hole in the center. A continuous spiral groove ran from the center to the edge, like a vinyl record. But when Evans leaned close, holding his kerosene lantern to the stone, he saw that the groove was not just a line. It was text. Microscopic hieroglyphs, carved with a laser-like precision that was impossible for the year 1947, and certainly impossible for the Stone Age. Lupa picked up one of the discs. He held it with a reverence that made Evans hold his breath. The alien placed the disc on a raised stone platform that looked like an altar. He spun it with his finger. It began to hum. It was a low frequency, a vibration that Evans felt in his teeth, in his bones. It was the sound of a machine trying to start. The granite resonated. It was an oscillation recorded 12,000 years ago, preserved in stone. Over the next few weeks, Evans and Lupa worked to translate the spiral. It was the Rosetta Stone of the cosmos. The translation that emerged was fragmented, poetic, and devastating. "We are the travelers of the clouds," Evans wrote in his diary, translating the vibrations. "We came in the year of the Great Fire. Our ships were bright as the sun. We sought the peaceful places, but the atmosphere, the storm, it took us." The narrative continued, spiraling outward. "We crashed in the high mountains. 10 ships. Only one survived the impact. Our brothers and sisters, lost to the ice. We, the survivors, hid in the caves. We are afraid of the men of the valley. They hunt us. They call us demons. We cannot fight. We have no weapons. We only have the memory of the stars." The most heartbreaking part was the technical log. The discs contained schematics, diagrams of propulsion systems, of energy couplings, of stellar navigation charts. Evans looked at the diagrams, complex, beautiful engineering, and then he looked at Lupa. Lupa was wearing rags. He was holding a crude stone scraper. Here was the tragedy of the Dropa. They were the descendants of astrophysicists, born into the Stone Age. They had the manuals for a starship, but they didn't have a screwdriver. They knew how to navigate a wormhole, but they couldn't forge iron. They were trapped in a technological paradox. They had the knowledge, but not the infrastructure. And over 12,000 years, the knowledge had become ritual. They didn't know how to build the engines anymore. They just knew that the drawings were sacred. They were worshiping the blueprints of a bus that broke down 10 millennia ago. One afternoon, Lupa brought Evans a specific disc. It was cracked. He pointed to a section of the groove that showed a specific component, something that looked like a power coupling. He pointed to the diagram, then pointed to the sky, and then pointed to Evans. The question was clear. Do your people have this? Dr. Evans looked at the diagram. It was advanced theoretical physics made manifest. It was anti-gravity technology. He thought of the factories in Manchester, the steam trains in London, the propeller planes of the Royal Air Force. Humanity was proud of its machines. But compared to this, we were children playing with mud. Evans looked into the wide blue eyes of the elder. He saw the desperation there. They had been waiting 12,000 years for someone smart enough to help them. They thought Evans was that man. They thought that finally, after all the centuries of hiding, the men of the valley had evolved enough to fix the ship. Evans closed the diary. He felt a lump in his throat so painful he could barely breathe. He had to tell them the truth. He had to tell them that Earth was still primitive, that he couldn't help them, that nobody could help them. "No," Evans whispered, shaking his head. We do not have this. We are not ready." Lue Pa stared at him for a long moment. The light in his eyes didn't fade, it just retreated. He took the disc back. He didn't cry. The Dropa had run out of tears thousands of years ago. He simply nodded, a gesture of infinite resignation. He accepted that the exile would continue. He accepted that he would die in this cave, just like his father and his father's father, all the way back to the crash. That night, Evans couldn't sleep. He listened to the wind howling outside the cave, the wind that kept them prisoner. He realized then that the Lolladoff plate wasn't just a record. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into the ocean of time, washing up on a shore where no one knew how to read. And the most terrifying thought was not that they were aliens. It was that they were intelligent, emotional, conscious beings, slowly rotting away in the dark, while the universe moved on without them. He returned to Oxford in the autumn of 1947. The trees along the Cherwell River were turning a brilliant, burning gold, dropping their leaves onto the wet cobblestones. It was a scene of perfect pastoral English beauty. But to Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans, it looked like a painting. It looked flat, artificial. He walked into his study surrounded by the smell of old paper, pipe tobacco, and beeswax. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was rhythmic, steady, sane. It was the heartbeat of a civilized world, but Evans could not hear it. In his mind, he was still hearing the wind howling through the Bayan-Har. He was still hearing the high-pitched, dolphin-like chatter of the Dropa. He was still feeling the vibration of the stone disc in his hands. Re-entry into society is difficult for any soldier returning from war, but Dr. Evans was not a soldier. He was a man who had seen the boundaries of reality dissolved. He looked at his colleagues, men of science, men of letters, and he felt a profound alienation. They argued about politics, about the post-war economy, about the curriculum for the spring semester. Evans sat in the faculty lounge, stirring his tea, thinking, "None of this matters. We are not alone, and we are ignoring them." He wanted to scream it. He wanted to stand on the table in the dining hall and throw his diary down among the silverware. He wanted to project the photographs he had taken, blurry and grainy, of the small people standing by their stone hives. But he didn't. He did what learned men do. He calculated the risk. He knew that in 1947, the world was still reeling from a global war. The public imagination was fragile. If an Oxford professor stood up and claimed he had lived with extraterrestrials in Tibet, he would not be hailed as a discoverer. He would be destroyed. He would be labeled a madman. His tenure would be revoked. His life's work would be erased. The scientific community is a church, and it has no patience for heretics who preach a gospel that cannot be measured with a ruler. So, the silence began. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Evans retreated into his work, but his heart was gone. He spent his nights locked in his study, reorganizing his notes, translating the transcripts he had made of the Dropa language. He called it the Lolladoff Report. It was a manuscript written not for his contemporaries, but for the future. He wrote with the desperate precision of a man who knows he is the only witness to a crime. As the years passed, the silence became harder to bear because the world was starting to catch up. In the 1960s, reports began to filter out of the Soviet Union. Russian scientists were becoming interested in the Dropa Stones. A Chinese researcher named Sum Nui had published a translation of similar discs found in caves, claiming they told the story of a space crash. Evans watched from afar as Tsum Nui was ridiculed. The Chinese Academy called him a fool. They forced him to resign. He died in disgrace, a broken man. Evans saw this, and he knew he had made the cowardly, safe choice. He saw his own potential fate in the destruction of the Chinese scholar. He kept his mouth shut. He kept the Lolladoff plate hidden in the false bottom of a drawer, wrapped in velvet, treating it like a radioactive isotope. But the Russians pushed further. In Moscow, a scientist named Dr. Vyacheslav Zaitsev placed the stone discs on an oscillograph. This was the moment that should have vindicated Evans. When the Russians spun the discs, the machine went wild. The stones vibrated. They hummed. Zaitsev reported that the discs had been charged with a high-voltage electrical current sometime in the distant past. They acted like hard drives, like magnetic tapes that still held a charge after 12,000 years. Evans read these reports in scientific journals. He sat in his armchair in England, trembling. "They know," he whispered to the empty room. "They are finding the pieces." But even then, he couldn't step forward. By the 1970s, the ancient astronaut theory was becoming a pop culture fad, filled with charlatans and fiction writers. Evans feared that if he released his diary now, it would be thrown onto the pile of paperback nonsense sold in drugstores. He feared the truth would be cheapened. He wanted the Dropa to be respected, not turned into a circus sideshow. The guilt began to eat him alive. He thought constantly of Lu Pa. He wondered if the old alien was still alive. He wondered if the tribe was still huddled in those caves, freezing, waiting for the return of the man from Oxford. He had promised them nothing. He had told them he couldn't help. But simply by being there, simply by listening, he had given them hope. And then he had left. He had come back to the warmth of his fireplace, to his 3 meals a day, to his comfortable bed. He had abandoned the castaways. Every time he looked up at the night sky, he felt the accusation. The stars were cold and indifferent, but he knew that somewhere in the Sirius system, or perhaps the Pleiades, there was a home that these people would never see again. And he knew that he was the only human being on Earth who knew their names. The diary entries from his final years are the most painful to read. They are not scientific observations. They are confessions. "I have failed them," he wrote in 1973. "I have kept the secret to save my own skin. I valued my reputation more than the truth. I am a coward. When I die, let this report be my penance. Let the world know that they are there, and let the world know that we left them behind." Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans died in 1974. The funeral was respectable. His colleagues spoke of his contributions to anthropology, of his steady, logical mind. They praised his rationality. They had no idea that the man they were burying was the keeper of the greatest secret in human history. After the funeral, his family cleared out his study. They found the dusty papers. They found the drawings of the small, large-headed beings. They found the Lolladoff plate. They didn't understand what they were looking at. To them, it looked like fiction, like a story the old man had written to entertain himself in his dotage. But we know better. We know that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of voices, voices that are still crying out from the high peaks of the Bayan-Har, waiting for someone to hear them above the wind. The silence of Dr. Evans was a dam holding back a flood. And with his death, the dam finally broke. The diary was opened. The signal was released. But the question remains, is it too late? The story of Dr. Karyl Robin-Evans does not end with his death. In fact, the most disturbing chapter began after he was buried. When the Lolladoff Report was finally leaked, it sent a shockwave through the fringes of the archaeological world. It gave a name and a face to the anomalies. But just as the truth began to surface, the evidence began to disappear. In the 1990s, independent researchers traveled to China, armed with Evans's coordinates and the older reports from Tsum Nui. They went to the museums in Xi'an and Beijing, where the discs had been catalogued. They asked to see the granite stones with the spiral grooves. They asked to see the bones of the small people. They were met with blank stares. Museum directors who had previously confirmed the existence of the stones suddenly claimed they never existed. Records were scrubbed, catalogs were rewritten. The manager of the Banpo Museum in Xi'an, when pressed by a reporter in 1994, simply said, "There are no stones, there is no mystery, please leave." But we know that matter does not simply vanish. 716 stone discs do not evaporate into thin air. They were moved. Somewhere, in a crate deep within a government archive, or perhaps in a private collection shielded from the public eye, the Lolladoff plates are gathering dust. The flight logs of a starship are sitting in the dark. The technology that could change the future of humanity, anti-gravity, clean energy, stellar mapping, is being hoarded. Or worse, it has been destroyed to protect the comfortable narrative of human history. Dr. Evans died believing he had failed the Dropa. But perhaps his failure was not personal. Perhaps it was a failure of our species. We were given a test. A cosmic neighbor crashed in our backyard, broken and bleeding, asking for a spare part. And instead of helping them, we hunted them. We called them demons. And when we finally understood who they were, we stole their diaries and hid the evidence. And what of the Dropa themselves? This is the thought that should keep you awake tonight. The Bayan-Har mountains are vast. They are unforgiving. There are valleys there that have not seen a human footprint in a century. It is possible, terribly, heartbreakingly possible, that they are still there. Imagine the descendants of Luapa today. Their numbers would be dwindling. The genetic defects from inbreeding would be severe. They would be smaller, frailer, their memories of the stars fading into myth. They likely no longer know how to read the stones. They no longer know that their ancestors were pilots. To them, the broken ship is just a sacred rock. The sky is just a ceiling they can never reach. They are a species waiting for a bus that stopped running 12,000 years ago. Every night, the Milky Way rises over the Himalayas. It shines with the same cold brilliance it did in 1947 and the same brilliance it did in 10,000 BC. Somewhere up there, circling a star we might have named but never visited, is a civilization wondering what happened to their expedition fleet. They don't know that their brothers and sisters are trapped in a cave on Earth, freezing to death, waiting for a rescue signal that we, the humans, have silenced. Dr. Evans wrote in his final entry that the universe is not cruel. It is simply indifferent. But I disagree. The tragedy of the Dropa is not an accident of nature. It is a tragedy of silence. The silence of the mountains, the silence of the governments, the silence of a man who was too afraid to speak until it was too late. We look for aliens with radio telescopes. We send gold records on Voyager probes into the void saying, "Hello, we are here, please come find us." We are so desperate not to be alone. Yet the evidence suggests that we are not alone. We never were. The guests arrived early. They knocked on the door, and we turned off the lights and pretended no one was home. The Lolladoff Report is all that remains. It is the only testimony for the prosecution. It is the only voice for the voiceless. By listening to this story, you have broken the silence. You have become a witness. Dr. Evans is gone. Luapa is gone. But the frequency of the stones still hums in the static of history. So, I ask you one final time. If the Dropa are still there, hiding in the mist of the Bayan-Har, do they deserve to be left alone? Or do we owe them a ride home? Look at the device in your hand. Look at the technology we take for granted. And ask yourself, where did it really come from? Did we invent it? Or did we finally figure out how to read the stolen diary of a stranded traveler? The truth is not out there. The truth is buried under the ice. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of the forbidden history, do not let it end here. Share this video. Break the algorithm like Evans wanted to break the silence. Leave a comment below with your verdict. rescue, or ignore. Let the algorithm know that we are watching. And for those of you who want to go deeper, who want to hear the other entries from the Forbidden Diaries that we couldn't air on this public channel, there is a link in the description. Join us on the dark side of history. Until then, keep looking up. But don't forget to look down. The answers might be buried right beneath your feet. This is the end of the Lolladoff Report. End transmission.